Afternoon. My name is Yara Murad, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Issam Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. And I'd like to welcome you all with us here today. Your commitment to this very important and crucial topic at hand is highly appreciated. I'd like to just note that the event today is going to be live streamed on the AGBU Facebook page as well. So our conference today is organized along with our partners and friends at AGBU, as well as Lepsius Haus, and with the support of the Vigian Partnership. Our collaboration with AGBU has in fact started since 2016, and we are honored to continue working with them on this very important cause. Today, we commemorate the International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the victims of the crime of genocide and of the prevention of this crime, which lies on the day of December 9th. In addition to dealing with the past and previous crises, including Armenia, Karabakh, and Yazidi instances of political violence, war crimes, and genocide, this year's conference will take a particular significance and a particular take given the atrocious war on Gaza. We have an incredible lineup of seasoned legal practitioners and experts, as well as a stellar journalist with decades of experience in this field. And we look forward to two excellent panels today. Before I hand the floor to my colleague at AGBU, Executive Director, Ms. Arine Ghazarian, I would like us all to take a virtual moment of silence for all the lives taken away by genocide and violence around the world. Thank you. Arine, the floor is all yours now.
Thank you, Yara. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, as we remember and honor the victims of the crime of genocide, let us not forget that the Genocide Convention, adopted in December 1948, was the first human rights treaty adopted by the UN General Assembly. And it remains as relevant as ever as we work to prevent genocide and other atrocities, crimes that are sadly still being perpetrated with impunity and no regard for human life. Since 2016, the Armenian General Benevolent Union has proudly been standing with the United Nations to highlight the issues of genocide awareness, human rights, and refugee assistance. Throughout the years, our members across the globe have organized discussions, symposiums, and lectures, all with a shared purpose that focuses less on our tragic history and more on what we are witnessing today. As the largest Armenian philanthropic organization in the world, AGBU continues its 117-year history of driving thoughtful conversations and impactful programming to support the global Armenian nation through cultural, educational, humanitarian, and socioeconomic development initiatives. Pathways to Lasting Justice, addressing genocide and ending human rights violations in the Middle East, will focus on the international protection system in the Middle East and its role in preventing, ending, and punishing human rights violations and abuses against minorities in the region. Furthermore, the webinar aims to shed light on the role of media and public opinion in ending all forms of human rights violations. On behalf of the leadership of AGBU Lebanon, I want to thank AUB's Issam Institute, the Lepsius Haus, all our speakers, and the Vigian Partnership. We hope these forums will help us invest in prevention and commit to upholding the responsibilities established by the Genocide Convention and will lead to much needed collaboration and action by the many stakeholders. And now, I would like to invite Paolo Airani, a UN international investigator, who will be moderating our first panel. Paolo, the platform is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Arine. Pleasure to be here and with the distinguished speakers who I will introduce. First of all, on panel one, we have Sheila Pailan. She's an international human rights lawyer and former legal advisor to the United Nations across countries and regions, with more than 15 years advising judges and senior officials of various UN-backed international criminal tribunals. The speakers will introduce their experience in more detail in a bit when it's their turn to present. We also have Rami George Khoury, a distinguished senior fellow at the Issam Institute at the American University of Beirut, an internationally syndicated political columnist and book author and professor of journalism. And we also have Nadia Napruzov, who's also an international lawyer and consultant, specialized in international law, human rights, and transitional justice, and working with the Yazidi community in Iraq and victims of ISIS and the genocide. Welcome, everyone. When panel one finishes presenting, there'll be panel two also presenting, but we're going to start with a short definition on genocide from Sheila, if you don't mind.
Sure, thanks. The definition of genocide is, I feel like I know it by heart, but it is very specific. So I'll read it out. It means legally, this is what it means. Any of 5 acts that I'll read out after, but any of 5 acts that are committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. So that means it has to be that they're intending to destroy the group on the basis of one of these 4 criterion, either national, ethnic, racial, or religious. That's not just like a corollary. They didn't kill them for some other reason and they happen to be whatever, it's for that reason. And the 5 acts are either by obviously killing members of the group. That's the most immediate way of destroying a group. But there are other ways, like causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. So that can be a lot of things. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, so then you cannot procreate and the group just sort of dies out, or forcibly transferring children of the group from one group to another so that they end up growing up as another, group. That's the definition. And so it creates confusion sometimes when people use it in contexts that are more sociological or historical and not necessarily legal. That doesn't mean it's not a genocide, but maybe legally it's not. So there you have it.
Thank you. Does Rami or Natia want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, if I could just add that there are war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. So there's these 3 broad titles or terms that are used, and they sometimes overlap, and they can sometimes cause confusion. That's why we have lawyers in this world to help us sort that out. And but it's important to recognize that this is a basket of bad behavior by states or by individuals, and I think this is what we want to keep in mind, that the ultimate issue here is how organizations, individuals, governments, whatever, behave badly and mistreat people, deny them their basic humanity, and that's why we have these 3 categories. But genocide is the worst one, and that's why it was given its own name.
Thank you. Anything from you, Natia?
Yes, maybe just 2 quick points, building on what was just said. I think what's often very, very difficult in the definition and characterization of genocide is the genocidal intent. It's very difficult to show and legally also prove that an individual had this purpose that Sheila just described. And then also, part of genocide, and I will explain it a bit for the Yazidis, is also not only targeting people, but also their culture, destroying, their places of worship, or even targeting their livelihoods to make sure that they cannot survive, beyond attacking them just as individuals.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good point. Intent. Often a conflict can be confused for one ethnic group trying to push another ethnic group out of a certain land or territory, and for genocide to be called genocide, yes, there has to be the intent and not some geographical gain or natural resources gain, which fuels a lot of conflict. Now that maybe some people in the audience don't have the legal or human rights background, so it's good that we put that in context and to to use more specific cases, so it makes sense why we're discussing this topic today. It is because, unfortunately, in our part of the world, in the MENA, human rights violations and war crimes and genocides are still taking place in the recent past, and possibly ongoing conflicts now. So we will draw from examples from your respective expertise and examples of genocide or other serious human rights violations, and take questions from the audience after the three different speakers had the chance to present. Sheila, if you'd like to start, please.
Sure, thank you. I really am honored to be sharing the panel with these people, these wonderful, distinguished speakers, but also the groups that they represent, because I think we share a lot of commonalities. The Armenians, the Yazidis, the Palestinians, it's just been calamity after calamity, atrocity after atrocity, impunity after impunity that brings us to where we are today. And so hopefully we, like, never again, but enough is enough. You know, that's sort of what we're trying to get to. I won't give the whole entire history of the Armenian people because that would take forever and ever. I'll focus on what just recently happened 2 months ago. On September 19th, Azerbaijan launched an extensive military assault on the de facto Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, also known to Armenians as Artsakh. And they did this under the guise of an anti-terrorist operation, which resulted in mass killings. This is an ongoing conflict, but that was kind of the final solution. Their aim was to force a new status quo on this region on its own terms, with no regard for the lives or basic human rights of this population. That has been an ongoing, long-standing thing. And it happened just after, and in this way, it's, you know, sort of a mini Gaza. They kept Artsakh under siege, under blockade for nearly 10 months, slowly starving this population of 120,000 Armenians and depriving them of basic necessities like food, fuel, electricity, and medicine. This act, this circumstance has been described as genocidal by the former ICC prosecutor and the former special advisor on the prevention of genocide. So after 24 hours of like heavy bombardment, and this population has already been really weakened by this blockade, the authorities of Nagorno-Karabakh surrendered. So they just laid down their arms, and the entire ethnic Armenian population started running for their lives because they were seriously like, okay, the Azeris are coming, yeah? So they began to flee the region. They all, in a matter of a few days, just poured into neighboring Armenia. And by the end of September, more than 100,000 ethnic Armenians had fled into Armenia. There was a continuous presence of Armenians, majority Armenians, in this region for thousands of years. And now the UN estimates there are less than 50. 50. I've actually said this to someone. They were like, what do you mean, 50,000? 50 what? 50. And I don't think it's even that much. I think that's a generous estimate. So Azerbaijani officials have been very quick to reject claims that this was ethnic cleansing or that this mass displacement was in any way forced. They say that the Armenians left voluntarily, that they would have been safe, you know, like everyone freaked out for nothing, they should have stayed. But, you know, this is just unbelievable. Nobody believes that. And so even Human Rights Watch has responded saying that's just not an assertion that is acceptable. And many international legal experts have expressed the view that the displacement was criminally forced. This is really relevant because Armenia has recently ratified the ICC statute, and so has become the 124th member state of the International Criminal Court. So for the first time ever, we have potentially a viable avenue of accountability for heinous crimes that are committed against Armenians, including the ethnic cleansing, or, you know, depending on whether this intent to destroy the group can be found, genocide. Armenia already has cases before the International Court of Justice against Azerbaijan and the European Court of Human Rights against Azerbaijan. but these courts are not competent to convict anyone of crimes. So we have now this added avenue to actually find accountability for crimes. This is really important for Armenians who've known nothing but injustice for over 100 years, including a genocide that happened 100 years ago. And so in what, this, to sort of bring it full circle and not take up too much time, this never again is always again and again. Enough is enough. And we're trying finally to use every available tool in the international toolkit to stop this and to find justice and in order to have deterrence, and this will have a global effect. So that's where we're at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I guess we will discuss the theme of this discussion, which is how to prevent this from continuing or happening again, and how to and punish those most responsible. But maybe and then we'll take some questions, but maybe we'll cover the other examples. Not yet, if you want to talk about the Yazidis and what happened to them in Iraq.
Sure. Thank you, Paolo. And I'm also very honored to be here. Thank you to the organizers and fellow panelists. As Paolo mentioned, I have been working with the Yazidi community for the past 5 years, actually. I'm based here in Iraq, and I have been specifically leading a project which is documenting ISIS crimes in order to bring justice to the Yazidis. So what happened to the Yazidis, it's actually interesting, Paolo. When you introduced me, you already said the Yazidi genocide. So what happened to the Yazidis is really almost like a textbook genocide. So, Yazidis are an ethno-religious minority group whose roots come from ancient Mesopotamia. So we have been around for over 6,000 years, according to our history. And we have been, very similarly to the Armenians, being targeted over and over again. It's difficult to give estimates, but we believe that 1.5 million Yazidis live around the globe, and the majority being in Iraq. So in Iraq, in 2014, when ISIS was advancing after having seized some territory in Syria into Iraq, they reached Sinjar, which is the homeland of the Yazidis, in August 2014. And they clearly came with the plan. And when I say that, I mean it literally, because ISIS was even publishing propaganda magazines. And in one of them, they clearly said that Yazidis needed to be eradicated. So when ISIS attacked Sinjar, they, in the first few days of the genocide, they killed around 5,000 people, mainly men and young adolescents, boys, young men, simply because they thought they would pose a threat, and that, they were too old to be brainwashed. When it comes to women and children, around 6,800 were enslaved, separated from their families, and then taken to captivity, and also for a huge majority used as sex slaves. And the younger boys were also militarized, so used as the cubs of the caliphate, like ISIS would call them. All these people were trafficked between different areas in Iraq and Syria, into Raqqa, Tel Afar, Mosul, and many survivors we have spoken to were sold and enslaved by dozens and dozens of ISIS members. And Paolo, you know that very well as well, having worked on this topic. So I was mentioning, beyond what is being done to people when a genocide happens, I was mentioning the destruction of cultural heritage. And when it comes to Yazidis, ISIS destroyed 68 temples and shrines in Iraq alone, which belonged to Yazidis. They also left behind around 90 mass graves, which are still being exhumed. And the process, as you can imagine, is taking time and is very slow. And then beyond that, they even targeted livelihood of Yazidis, destroying wells because people live from farming in the area, making sure they could not return, and going as far as destroying beehives. So Yazidis produce honey, and this is something that is, very important to Yazidis, and knowing that ISIS even destroyed that. Survivors in the Yazidi community in general say that the genocide is still ongoing. And this is because, of course, ISIS hasn't been brought to justice yet, but also around 2,700 Yazidis are still missing, and we are sure many of them are still being trafficked. And around 200,000 Yazidis still live in IDP camps, so in tents, displaced from their homeland. I focus on Yazidis today, but I also want to acknowledge that, because this is my work, but I also want to acknowledge that ISIS also attacked other minorities in Iraq, including Christians, Shia, Turkmens, Kakai, Shabaks, and also Sunni community, Assyrians as well. And the goal of ISIS was really to destroy the diversity of Iraq and make it one caliphate where everyone will literally look the same. And the difference with these other communities is that the difference with Yazidis and these other communities is that these other communities most of the time were given a choice. So they either could pay a tax and stay or leave, but the Yazidis were only given the choice to convert or to die. And even in cases where they converted, they were killed or enslaved. So very briefly, when it comes to justice and what has been done, so not much, unfortunately. There have been many genocide recognitions of the Yazidi genocide. I mean, the UN did that twice with the Commission of Inquiry on Syria, but also UNITAD. Many countries have recognized, but in terms of pure legal recognition, so far we had only 3 convictions of ISIS members for genocide in Germany. And unfortunately, Iraq right now still doesn't have a legal framework to prosecute international crimes, including genocide, and is not a state party to the ICC. So I will stop here, but just to give you an overview.
Thank you very much. Rami?
Yes, thank you, and I'm delighted to be with you and learn a lot from everybody. I'll make a couple of points about the Palestinian situation and how it relates to genocide and other crimes. One of the most important distinctions in Palestine is that the accusations of genocide, which has to be proven in a court, and the accusations can be made by anybody, but the courts ultimately prove them. The genocide of the Palestinians at the hands of first Zionism and then the State of Israel, with the complicity usually of first Great Britain and later now the United States and other big Western powers. This genocide has been going on for about a century. So genocide is not just a single act, it's a process over time that takes away your land, your culture, your identity, your rights, and ultimately your very biological humanity. Starving people, denying them food, which has happened in the past to all of the cases we're talking about here and is happening today in Palestine. But this has been going on since literally a century. In 1923 is when the League of Nations put into effect its mandate for historic Palestine, which the country of Great Britain was given responsibility to manage it after it was liberated after World War I. And the British included in the mandate document the specific contents of the Balfour Declaration, in which England, Great Britain in 1917 made a promise in a letter to the Zionist movement that it favors the creation of a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the small Zionist movement always had in mind a state, but they used the term homeland because it made it softer to happen. And so this process started in 1923, and now we're 2023. And what you're seeing in Gaza is the culmination, the most severe example of genocide in action, of mass displacement of people, killing people, depriving them of their fundamental needs, causing great pain, etc., etc. And the single most common accusation that Palestinians and others have against Zionism in the state of Israel is that it aims to evict the Palestinians, or as many as possible, from the land of Palestine and replace them with the Jewish population of settlers and immigrants and locally born Jews. And of course, there historically always was a small Jewish population. They're indigenous to the land. But when the Balfour Declaration was made, the promise to create a Jewish homeland, the Jews made up around maybe 4% of the population, and the Arabs are about 96%, and Christians and Muslims, mostly Muslims. But this process of taking the land and creating a Jewish majority state happened over a century and continues. The settlements continue. People are still being thrown out of their homes in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So it's important to recognize genocide as an ongoing process with multiple dimensions and multiple tools. Very respected international scholars and lawyers in Europe and the United States have said clearly, I just attended a seminar in New York earlier this week on this, they've clearly said that Israel meets at least 3 of the criteria, of the 5 criteria for genocide, which is intent, incitement, and action. And the actions, what Israel has done, I don't want to repeat all the things that we all know that have led to this mass suffering and desperation in Gaza, have not been done only by Israel. They've been assisted and made possible by continuous and even increasing support from the United States mainly, but also Great Britain and other Western countries. And it's that for that reason that many Palestinian groups like Al-Haq, Al-Mizan, Adala, many others have started, first they've been giving warnings for years about this, and now they've started exploring how to do legal action. And the interesting thing, I think, happening in the Palestine case is that people around the world are starting to explore the use of courts, justice systems, national systems. I mean, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice in The Hague are a separate world, and they will be dealt with if people take cases there, and there are cases that are going to be made there. But already people are already gone to court in the United States. There's a case that was raised by the Center for Constitutional Rights with a few other very serious legal groups working with it, American groups, and accusing the Biden in person and the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and others in this administration of being complicit in the crime of genocide in Palestine, in Gaza, in Palestine. This is fascinating, and we will find out in the next month or 2 where this goes. In Europe, you have similar. There's a case in Scotland, I think, that's just been raised about asking the courts to determine if British supplies of war equipment, complex, sophisticated radar and intelligence and weapons and all kinds of things to Israel, if these are being used in the genocide or in the genocide, is this possible? Is this allowed? Should it be stopped? And in the Netherlands, there's a case saying that parts made in the Netherlands are being used in some of the American warplanes that are going to Israel to attack Palestinians. So you're starting to get the use of these courts around the world. You know, the Israelis always say, the Americans, of course, repeat this 3 times a day, that Israel has the right to defend itself. But in law, there is no self-defense criteria for anybody carrying out the kinds of things we're seeing Israel doing, the genocidal acts. That you can't claim self-defense to do genocide. And therefore, this is going to become more and more legally contentious around the world. and I think it'll slowly spill over into the political field. You're seeing already in the United States, members of Congress, mostly, saying, look, we can't give Israel another $10 billion if they're going to use this money to do this genocide. And so this is new. This is unprecedented, and it's new, and it's important. The more fascinating thing for me is that individuals potentially could be held complicit and accomplices to genocide in other countries in court cases if they do not carry out the obligation of an International Court of Justice ruling that was done some years ago that specifically says if any person or state or organization has knowledge of actions that could be genocidal and is contributing to that process, whether with arms or money or political protection, like the US protects Israel at the UN, if anybody is providing something to the genocide practitioner that helps the genocide go on, that individual could be personally found complicit and guilty, and maybe could be punished. And this is really starting to kick in now in the US, which is probably one reason why Biden and Blinken 3 times a day are saying we've got to have more humanitarian aid for the Palestinians. Maybe they're trying to protect themselves. We'll see. So there's all these interesting dimensions that are happening and need to be studied. And finally, I would put this in a wider context in the Middle East and the Arab world, but the Arab world, which is the one I know best, is that the way that the Israelis are behaving, which is the way that every genocidal actor behaves, is they basically ignore the law. They say the law doesn't apply to us. We're unique, and we have to defend ourselves, or something. They'll come up with these, or they all come up with the same arguments and same excuses, and they ignore the accusations and the law. This matches with the contemporary tradition in the Arab region, which we've seen in the last probably 40, 50 years, but certainly in the last 15 years since the Arab uprising started in 2010, where you've had entire populations almost in the street asking for, reform of government, better government, more rights for the citizens. And the main response of the governments was a combination of military action, killing their citizens or imprisoning them or beating them up, and ignoring them. Some countries did more beating up, some countries did less beating up, but they just ignored what their citizens were saying. And after a while, the citizens got tired. They had to go to work and make money and feed their kids. They couldn't go out to the streets every day. So what we're seeing in the genocidal arena is countries that are accused of genocide are essentially ignoring the accusations. And they come up with all kinds of different diversionary tactics. And I see this all the time here in the United States in my routine engagements in speaking or teachings or media or whatever. You say something about what Israel is doing, and it's factual. And the person defending Israel will tell you, oh, but Israel is a good country, it's a democracy, or we respect LGBTQ rights, or we have great environmental protection movements or something. They'll try to change the subject. That worked beautifully for about a century for the Zionist movement and the Israeli government, but it's not working as well anymore. So this is a crucial turning point, and that's why you see massive actions, demonstrations all over the world, supporting Palestine, supporting a ceasefire, and supporting equal rights for Israeli and Palestinian states. And this is a process now that we have to keep our eye on, and it's very closely linked to the genocidal issue, because people, whenever Joe Biden goes anywhere, there's demonstrators outside his hotel saying, "Genocide Joe, how are you doing today?" So Genocide Joe has become his nickname. Like those of us old enough to remember Vietnam in the 60s and Lyndon Johnson, where demonstrators would say, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? In other words, American troops in Vietnam. And Joe Biden's getting the same thing. And this activism, public activism by young people is really a very historic and important process. And we have to keep our eye on it. And it's because of what's happening in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Rami. Yes, Yeah, that was a very, very important point. Also, the fact that it doesn't have to be a single conflict; could be historical actions one after the other to show the intent of one group to commit genocide. Now, and the last point you raised about the young generation and what is happening now. Yeah, I think civil society bears the brunt of mobilizing the conscience of people around the world. NGOs like AGBU and others who push the topic and keep it in the minds of people, because genocide is one thing that scares nations. As you said, it's the worst of the worst. You know, as a police officer, we knew homicide was like the most severe of crime. You had robberies and you had assaults and you had all kinds of other things, but homicide was the one where we dedicated the most resources, because that's the most severe, where you take someone's life. In the international law, you know, you have forced displacement and you have crimes against humanity and war crimes, but genocide is the big bad word that really makes countries and governments shake. And that's why it's important to discuss it now, not to take away from other crimes, because in my investigation, I've interacted with communities who wanted our team to say it's a genocide, and it wasn't genocide because of the legal implications and everything that it carries, how much weight the charge carries. But other violations are just as serious. They just have take a different nature. So what I'd like to do is go back to Sheila, and it's very good. I think the most important step that Armenia could have done was to join the International Criminal Court, sign up to the Rome Statute. But the ICC doesn't investigate what happened before. It just, from the day a government joins or a country joins, that they go forward for any offenses that happen. Nothing they can do about what happened before, which I guess is the case in the latest conflict for Armenia.
Actually, that's not entirely accurate. Yes, normally that's true, but there's a mechanism by which we can accept retroactive jurisdiction. The hard line is the date of the creation of the International Criminal Court. So nothing before like 2002. But if Armenia wants, and Armenia has made this declaration, that we accept temporal jurisdiction retroactive to 10 May 2021. So nothing before then. But everything, 14 November 2023 is when we ratified. 60 days from then is going to be when the Rome Statute enters into force for Armenia. So this is very legal, but it only enters into force for Armenia as of February 1st, 2024. So normally, that's the date on which everything sort of, that's when the ICC has jurisdiction over the territory and the citizens of Armenia. But we have said we want you to have it, and backwards 2 years, or yeah. Just to sort of, it's good, and obviously I'm very proud. I've been part of a movement to try to get this to happen here. I'm really, really, really proud of Armenia for taking this big step. There was a lot of resistance, especially from Russia, because it kind of happened around the time when Putin got an arrest warrant against him. And Armenia is a really small country. It depends a lot on Russia, or it has up to date. So it's very brave for Armenia to do this. And it's, for me as an international criminal lawyer that has worked on many, many other conflicts, I see this and it is a contribution to the international legal order to sort of, push back on what Rami said before, that these authoritarian regimes and genocidal regimes ignore the law, and that is what Azerbaijan does. And Azerbaijan is really open about it. They're like, might is right. I think it was yesterday or maybe even today that President Ilham Aliyev said, we brought peace to the region by war. We brought it with war, and the world should take note, because this is now the new reality. This is how you solve conflicts, through the use of force, as if the UN Charter doesn't exist. Okay, so there is a disturbing shift in the dismissal of the international legal order in despots like Putin and Aliyev and Netanyahu and who have you, who get away because they get away, because there is impunity. It emboldens these perpetrators. And yes, there's major complicity, in our case, complicity by Russia, complicity by Turkey, and complicity by Israel, who supplied arms to Azerbaijan, who supports Azerbaijan majorly. And it's just this axis of, I don't want to use the term axis of evil, but we have to fight back, okay? Because otherwise we're going to end up in a really, really dark world that nobody wants to live in. These efforts by civil society are important, but ultimately, if we don't hold not only perpetrators accountable, but regimes that are, it's like the ultimate regimes that have to be toppled, and that lies in the power of the people to not only seek accountability, but to seek like good governance and ensure that it's not just about punishing a couple of soldiers and then thinking we've got the problem solved, because we see that not only do these crimes get perpetrated again and again, and it's not just in these three contexts, but it's not normal for, like, this isn't working at some point, So universality for the Rome Statute, but also more action, more activism, and like serious activism. Yeah, I'm going to go that far. Otherwise, we're just on a slippery slope downhill. Yeah.
Okay, so on the topic of prevention, and I guess the reason for you pushing Armenia to join the ICC, if Azerbaijan is not a member and the ICC opens an investigation in what happened, what are they capable of doing if they cannot investigate or get any cooperation from Azerbaijan?
So they don't need cooperation by Azerbaijan. You can investigate crimes without a perpetrator's cooperation. That's sort of pretty normal. But it's the territory of Azerbaijan is off limits because they are not a state party. The territory of Armenia, different story. Now, Azerbaijan last year, September 2022, invaded Armenia and committed some war crimes in Armenia. And with the case of the mass forced displacement of the Armenians that I just described, that happened 2 months ago, the crime of deportation is a crime against humanity occurred once this population entered Armenia, crossed an international border. This is the same thing that happened with the Rohingya when they crossed over into Bangladesh. Myanmar is not a state party to the ICC. Bangladesh is, and there's an open case, so there's jurisprudence to allow for this, and in a sort of, I saw this coming because, for people who are involved in this region, we saw this coming. There's a long-standing, decades-long state policy of anti-Armenian hatred. Aliyev hates us, and people in Azerbaijan have been brainwashed to hate us. So this final solution is very genocidal. There were many miscarriages during the blockade. Thousands of Armenian soldiers have been killed. We cannot afford, in order to actually sustain ourselves as a group, like the Yazidis are 1.5 million. In Armenia, we're about less than 3 million. Worldwide, I think it's like 8 million or something, but this isn't, we're, so to speak, an endangered species, yeah? We can't sustain this. So, yeah, it's like it is the legal situation that's going to have to be, but we have the jurisdiction is there, the crimes are there, and there's a real chance now. Hopefully, we'll get there with some advocacy. We'll be able to actually have this case opened for the ICC.
Thank you, Nadia. In the absence of Iraq being a member of the ICC, like most countries in the Middle East, with the exception of Jordan, Afghanistan, Armenia, and Tunisia, I guess. what role, since this is the topic of this discussion, can the international legal system play to end and punish and hold those accountable in cooperation with maybe national courts in the case of the Yazidi genocide, for example?
Yes, thank you. One step the UN, with the approval of Iraq, has taken is to create a mechanism, an investigative mechanism called UNITAD. And Paolo, you have been also working with them for a few years now. So that was a very good step. And it was really because of advocacy of Yazidi survivors and Yazidi NGOs who went to the UN and told them, like, if you don't react after what Daesh, ISIS did, then, you know, you're basically not serving your purpose. Following that, a UN mechanism was created and is operating currently in Iraq, has been collecting evidence, interviewing Yazidis, but also many other communities, documenting mass sites and also exhuming them. And this is a very positive step. However, this mechanism is now endangered. Because, as I said, it's operating in Iraq based on Iraq's approval. It's a Chapter 6 mechanism of the UN Charter. Recently, so 2 months ago, Iraq, when it was asked about the renewal of UNITAD, said that it could be renewed for a year only. So basically, UNITAD has to close by September 24, which is something that was received with a lot of distress and shock by survivors and NGOs like Yazda, which I have been working with, and many others. As a reaction, we put out a statement which was endorsed by 50 Iraqi NGOs and survivor groups, which is a huge milestone in itself. And it really shows that Iraqi society in its entirety is against that step taken by Iraq. We are continuing the advocacy, and we hope that Iraq will change its mind, but it's very difficult. And what makes it even harder is that if Iraq would take concrete steps, then, you know, UN mechanisms are meant to be temporary, right? They cannot be in a country forever. And that was also always the understanding with UNITAD. But Iraq is not really taking any steps to prosecute for genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes. As I mentioned, there is no legislation. Even if Iraq wanted to start, you know, tomorrow cases, these are very complex cases. So you need capacity building. You need to know how to move these cases forward. You need witness protection. A lot of witnesses are afraid that UNITAD's evidence will end up with Iraq and their lives will be threatened because they were promised that this was collected by a UN entity. And most of them, unfortunately, don't trust Iraq because of Iraq's failure to protect them when ISIS attacked. In terms of the ICC, we have been lobbying Iraq for years now to join the ICC, to at least lodge a declaration under Article 12.3, which would allow for the ICC to, you know, at least work on what happened when ISIS came. Iraq is resisting, and one main reason is because they don't want the ICC to look into the potential crimes committed by other parties in that conflict, including their own army. So the whole thing is politicized. And, you know, actually a few weeks ago, the ICC prosecutor was in Iraq, but it remains very unclear about what's going to happen next. And I think that's also a problem, because a visit like that raises a lot of expectations in survivor groups, but not knowing what's going to be next is also not ideal. So we hope that something will come out of this visit. And then you mentioned some countries like Tunisia, which are state parties. And I'm sure the audience knows that ISIS was joined not only by Iraqis and Syrians, but also by thousands of foreign fighters from over 80 countries, including MENA, from the MENA region, and Tunisia is one of them. I have rarely, you know, analyzed, and I have analyzed hundreds of statements of Yazidis, and I have rarely seen any where Tunisian members are not mentioned. So Tunisian ISIS fighters, and Tunisia is quietly taking their nationals back, but no one really knows what's happening. Are they being prosecuted? But for what? So that could be, for example, a situation where the ICC could intervene, and ICC usually only when a state party has agreed to the ICC jurisdiction only intervenes if the state party doesn't do anything or cannot do it. So in this situation, it might be that one of these 2 points apply. So yeah, just to finish on one last point, it's, as I said, the cases that are happening are in Germany. We had 9 cases so far, 3 for genocide and the rest for crimes against humanity and war crimes. And this also sends a very distressing message to survivors. It means that they need to travel thousands of kilometers into a country they don't speak the language of, they don't know the culture, they don't even understand the legal system. And this is where they get justice. And it's somehow comforting. Of course, they want that, but Iraq should be, and the international community should do more to address these crimes.
Thank you. We have 6 minutes before we move on to the second hour and panel 2. So I'll go to the questions from the audience. And Rami, if you want to answer, otherwise one of the other speakers. This is from Garen. Question for all the panelists: given the immense difficulty in proving genocide within the court of international law, does the term fail and its supposed intent to prevent widespread ethnic cleansing and displacement and destruction of one group of people? To add to that, if the international legal mechanisms and bodies like UN or ICC are incapable of preventing genocide, then what must be done? Is there a way? Is there a solution? An answer?
I'm happy to give a comment. Can you hear me? Okay, because my computer stopped and I switched to the phone, so it seems to work. In the final analysis, this is all political. The legal framework is critically important in places where people take the law seriously. In many of these countries, including sometimes even in the United States, which we're seeing now, an incredible battle between Donald Trump and his group and the legal system, that even when people try to override the legal system or ignore it, the legal system can come back and kick them in the rear. In most of our region, the legal system is not very firm. And this is part of the continuing negative impact of the colonial era, that we have all these countries. I'm talking mostly about the Arab countries now. Other countries are not exactly the same, but similar. And most of the Arab countries have, broadly speaking, not done very well in the 3 critical categories over the last century of statehood, sovereignty, and citizenship rights. Some are better than others, but mostly they're all flailing. And this is one of the consequences, that people can get away with crimes and theft and corruption. But slowly, people are finding mechanisms to hold them accountable. Sometimes in the country, sometimes overseas, sometimes international organizations, sometimes universal jurisdiction in other countries. So I think it's a political process, and only when massive political mobilization and advocacy happen will the legal system be able to play a more significant role. The difficulty in the Palestine situation and the genocidal acts of Israel and Gaza, and there's very little doubt in the minds of scholars and experts, legal experts I've talked to about this, there's very little doubt that Israel has shown the intent and the actions that are genocidal, that it wants to get rid of the Palestinians. It keeps trying to send them from Gaza to Sinai now. And the US is kind of trying to help it in many ways, even though it says it doesn't want to. But the fact that this keeps going on shows that in the end, it's not a question only of facing the actor who is taking these genocidal actions, but the powerful forces behind them who support them for various reasons. And this is why we have a global mobilization of young people protesting against genocide and for a ceasefire. The ceasefire is the immediate call in Gaza, but behind it is a bigger call for ending impunity and creating a more just situation. So this is a work in progress, and it's extremely political, but politics in the end change. Politics can change, and they change when people are mobilized and they take action. And we see that today in the United States. We see it. Public opinion is starting to evolve because there's a lot of mobilization, a lot of advocacy, a lot of people pushing back against the US government and the Israeli Zionist forces. And therefore, new things are slowly starting to happen.
Okay, thank you. We only got a couple of minutes left, but we got 3 questions. So another question from Garen was for you, that you mentioned the protests in Israel against the justice reforms there, and how is it possible that an obvious settler colonial society can get away with pursuing liberal reforms while simultaneously oppressing Palestine? They're preaching something, and the same side is doing something else. So question is, what historical process has led to the ability to completely remove Palestinians from the purview of human rights in Israeli society? And if we can be brief, because I got a couple of questions for
very brief. One word: apartheid. They run apartheid systems. All settler colonial systems have used genocide, and many of them have had apartheid type systems to be able to do that. And we see it in Israel.
Okay, so it seems like they want to apply international standards of human rights and have free speech within their own society, but not on the Palestinians. It's double standards when it comes to the Palestinians. It's the us and them.
The United States did this with Black people and Native Americans, and it's a classic settler colonial process.
Thank you. Maybe this one for Sheila is from Gary. Extensive and very impressive work is being done to document genocides and judgments, and it's achieved by the ICC. But how are these judgments going to be enforced when we see time and again that might is right and geopolitics ignore ICC decisions and warnings about impending genocide? How are those judgments going to be enforced when politics come into play?
Well, there's a bit of confusion there, because judgments are enforced at the ICC and they are applicable to the individuals who are found criminally responsible. That's how the ICC works. The ICJ is a different story, the International Court of Justice, and also those cases, they're only applicable to the states that are party, but this is a matter of state responsibility. So the question, technically is compounded. I think it's meant to say, when are the genocides going to stop? I think it's only going to, first of all, I mean, human nature is that there is a very dark side to the human species. So you never fully get rid of crime, but you have criminal justice systems, and they do need to have like proper police state, like a proper police and a proper enforcement. And at the international level, we don't really have that. So there is work to be done to improve state cooperation, and also at the UN level to have more enforcement of international peace and security. And without that, we're living in a bit of a state of anarchy.
Okay, tying into that, if I could take a couple more minutes before panel 2 starts. From Lavinia, in your opinion, is the international criminal law indeed felt as a possible avenue in the so-called MENA region? Is it being considered at all? And do you think other countries of the region are likely to join the ICC's Rome Statute? Or do you think there may be a state in the region willing to enforce international criminal law through universal jurisdictions or any other means? Is the interest there from any of the MENA states?
Who's this for? This for me?
Any of the speakers?
I would say quickly, they express interest, but they're not really very serious about it. You have in every Arab country virtually a national organization for human rights, usually run by some senior person in the ruling family or the ruling elite or the power structure, but they're not very serious about actually implementing, unless there's massive pressure from below. This happened in the year or two after the uprisings in Tunisia brought about a serious change in governance, and there were mechanisms that were serious, but now they're going back. So I don't think we should look for internal changes that bring about serious reliance on the law as a means of bringing about justice. This is part of the price we pay for living in the appendages of colonialism. And the big lesson, overall of this for me is, having lived in the Middle East for 55 years now, the colonial period is still here. Colonialism has not ended. It's not only in Israel where there's settlers coming in, but the colonial impact of northern white states, mostly northern white states, that colonial impact is felt throughout the economy, environmental degradation, minority conditions, war making, anything you look at, we still suffer the colonial hangover, and this is why the world, I think, has rallied to the Palestine cause, because I think most of the people in the global South and many in the North understand that the Palestinians are waging the last great colonial battle in the world to decolonize.
Thank you. No more questions, but a comment from Annie, and I'll just summarize it about the problems of minorities and disadvantaged communities in the MENA region, and the importance of social media and mobilizing the youth for these different communities to connect together, be it the Armenians or the Palestinians or the Yazidis, and raise their voice to get more attention, get more mobilization, to pressure, I guess, the governments. On a final comment from my end, it is a difficult subject. I mean, right now the highest criminal court in the world that can act on genocide and human rights is the International Criminal Court, but the resistance in the MENA is obvious from governments where once you sign up, you're opening the door. If there's protests like the Arab Spring and people are being shot or beaten, then even without your authorization or consent, the International Criminal Court can come into your country, start an investigation, and have charges against the heads of state, the head of the police, anyone who is held as the most responsible for authorizing these crimes. So obviously a lot of work needs to be done by civil society and the international community to pressure MENA governments to sign up with financial incentives like the IMF and everything else that comes along. I will move to panel number 2 and introduce the moderator, Marie-Josée Dawood, editor of L'Orient Today, who will introduce the speakers on panel 2. Thank you very much for speakers on panel 1.
Thank you, Paulo, and hello, everyone, and thank you, all of you. It was really interesting to follow the conversation and learn about all the case studies. Thank you very much for that. And hi, everyone. So I'm Marie-Josée, so I go by MJ. And the second panel is going to be about the role of media and public opinion in ending all forms of human rights violation and advancing national and international efforts to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, including their incitement. And so with me on the panel, I'm going to introduce the 3 panelists with me. So we have with us Arwa Darman, who is an award-winning journalist known for covering some of the most pivotal political and humanitarian crises in the Middle East and beyond. She spent 17 years at CNN as a senior international correspondent, and she covered the war in Iraq, the Arab Spring, the fighting in Syria, and the war on ISIS. She left the network last year to work on her independent documentary. Good afternoon, Arwa. Happy to have you with us.
Thank you.
With us also, we have Carlos Curutusa, who's an award-winning freelance journalist and media trainer. He has covered conflict along parallel 33 from Western Sahara to Eastern Balochistan for international English-speaking publications such as The Guardian, Al Jazeera, Vice News, Middle East Eyes, Deutsche Welle. His last book, Respirando Fuego, covers 15 years of ground reporting in the 4 parts of Kurdistan. Hello, Carlos. Glad to have you with us.
Hi.
Great. And we have Taline Mujian, who's a freelance video reporter and filmmaker based in Yerevan, Armenia. She has been working as France 24 Armenia correspondent for 2 years now. She covered both the South Caucasus and Ukraine, mostly for France 24 and Radio France Internationale. She focuses on war zones, refugees, unpunished war crimes. She's also now in the process of making her first feature documentary, which follows the story of a young refugee from Nagorno-Karabakh. Hello, Tallinn. Nice to have you with us.
Hi, thank you.
So going straight to the subject, I think I'm going to open the panel with the first broad question, which is like, what's the role of media in covering and preventing genocide, and what have we done in the past, and what can we do today? So I think, Arwa, you wanted to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I did. Thank you. And thank you for these introductions and for the opportunity to have this conversation. This is a bit of a depressing starting point, but if I had to sort of sum up my experience as a journalist for the last 20 years, it would be that one of the most disheartening things has been something of a realization that the media can fight, bleed, die, trying to cover atrocities and crimes against humanity and mass bombardment and not be able to change the course of history. Now, that being said, of course, it doesn't mean that we give up. Absolutely not. We keep fighting. But I think back to what happened in Syria, for example, where we had, countless young citizen journalists crawling on their bellies, trying to get one shot of a tank firing or an airstrike just to be able to prove that civilians were being targeted. All of the Syrian journalists and foreign journalists who died covering everything that was happening and everything that has happened since. And it really, it makes you question what power coverage can have in the moment of trying to prevent something from happening. I've often felt as if, we can try to highlight the direction in which we see a situation going. And along the same lines of Syria, we can also bring Iraq into this conversation. Many of us who were covering Iraq, and I started working there in 2003. By 2012, when the US military was withdrawing from Iraq, we could, to a certain degree, see the writing on the wall, for lack of a better way to put it. We were listening to warnings that were coming from Al Anbar province, which was, historically speaking, Al Qaeda's stronghold and the Islamic State of Iraq stronghold. We could see and make the connection between what was happening in Syria and what was potentially going to be happening in Iraq. We were warning of the rise of extremism and radicalism and what needed to actually be done to try to rein it back in, bring it under control, and not allow the violence to get amplified to an even greater level. But despite all of the reporting when it came to both Syria and Iraq at the time, the truth is that without greater political will over which we, the media, have no control, very little can actually be done. And that renders our job to one which is effectively not reporting the news because we're going to necessarily create change, but reporting the news because history does in fact need to be documented. But that makes it just as important, because there will come a point in time when humanity will hopefully, at the very least, begin to learn from its mistakes of the past.
Hope for that, I agree. Thank you, Arwa. And to go back actually on your point of warning, like of saying, hey, this is going to happen, and warning people like we're seeing it, this is how it's going to happen. There is a real role of journalists, and actually especially local journalists in every country, to warn, to say, hey, we're here, we're seeing it, let us tell you what it is. And I think Carlos and Tallinn, actually, you wanted to mention the role of local journalists who are here before the atrocity, during atrocity, and after atrocity. So I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. Yeah, I'm always insisting on the importance of local journalists. During the war in Karabakh in 2020, there were lots of us, well, not that many, but quite a lot of foreign reporters who traveled to Artsakh to report on the ground. And I had the feeling that many among us didn't know much about that conflict. We might have experience covering conflict here and there, but although I had been in Artsakh and in Armenia before, I realized that I was sometimes I felt a bit lost on the ground. On the other hand, you would have these local journalists who, of course, know what's going on. They're local. They speak the language. They're based there. They are from Stepanakert or maybe from Armenia, and they traveled to Artsakh when everything kicked off. But they didn't have the tools to reach out to international media, and at the same time they suffered from, I would say, a lot of self-imposed red lines. Armenia is a small country. Whatever you write will be read by many people around you, and there's always this feeling of trying to avoid writing or reporting something that could harm your people. And of course, there's also the communication. There was also the communication policies of the government back then, both in Artsakh and in Armenia. But as you mentioned before, local journalists are always there. By the time we get to Stepanakert, it's already too late. That should have been reported way before. And it comes to mind also the 9 months blockade before the last offensive by Azerbaijan. It was just local journalists there. There was no way to get in, and it's only thanks to those people who are in Stepanakert and in the rest of Artsakh that we could get a sense of what was actually happening. So that's why I really believe that this is the best way. The best way I can help to bring the story out is now to train local media, local journalists, so they can reach out to the outside world.
Yes, I completely agree with Carlos, and it would be very encouraging if on the ground we could see more senior reporters from international medias who would be willing to show solidarity and help to share their resources with the local journalists who very often just don't have the access, don't even know where to start with to get in touch with international medias. And they are also being blocked by another factor that is, and I think it's the same issue with scholars. It's like when you are ethnically linked to the topic that you are covering, there is a risk of being automatically considered as emotionally biased. And well, this is of course very dangerous because on one hand it shows some racist bias by some editors in chief that might happen sometimes, or it can like as you said, it brings a need of self-censorship, like they self-censor themselves in their stories, or also just the fact of not being taken seriously, and that blocks a lot the local journalists in their work. And this is of course ridiculous because we are as smart as anyone to be critical about the topics that we talk about. But I do think that this emotional link that we have is actually a great tool to do to inform better, because there is another purpose in covering those issue. And like, of course, the local journalists will be more knowledgeable about their area because it's a very complex history, and they will also have more interest in being extremely accurate and efficient about the type of information they are sharing to bring awareness and to bring proofs. They have another purpose behind that. And yes, it is more logical that someone who's been born and raised in this geographical zone or in this culture will be more knowledgeable. And it's true that when we see sometimes some foreign journalists coming on top of our daily life of work, we feel that we have also a responsibility to give some quick history and geopolitical lessons to foreign journalists who, and I don't blame them, because of course their editors-in-chief ask them to be extremely versatile, and to be able to jump from one topic to the other. And especially with such complex regions as the South Caucasus, you can't catch up centuries of history by reading the Wikipedia page on the plane on your way to Armenia or Nagorno-Karabakh or anywhere else. This is a caricature, of course, but it's just a way of pointing out that it's very difficult to accomplish this mission, let's say, of documenting history when you don't know it very well in the first place.
Yes, definitely. The stories that come from local journalists, like everywhere around the world, are actually stories that are really grounded in local culture and local communities. And what I would like to mention about actually working with local journalists, and also like when a newspaper or when a publication sends foreign journalists, is the importance of working with editors and convincing editors about the importance of the story, about the nuances of the culture, etc. So I really think that not necessarily a lot of people know that journalism is, yes, it's one journalist, but it's also a chain of command behind, where you have editors, you have senior editor, you have editor-in-chief, etc. And Arwa, you were mentioning that you had to fight to keep Syria in the publication, in the channel for some time. Would you want to share that?
Yeah, and just to give a bit of background on kind of how the process works behind the scenes, so to speak. So yes, I was at CNN, and if there's a big breaking news story, it becomes what we call a bit of a no-brainer, right? Like everyone gets deployed, everyone gets sent over, a whole ton of resources are sent in. When it ends up being a bit more challenging is when you want to sort of develop that continuity of reporting. I mean, yes, of course, there are some stories where it's sort of a bit more cut and dry in the sense of it's one isolated incident that happened. You can cover it for X amount of time. And then as a network, you can more or less move on, which is, exactly what happens. The news especially has a very finite level of attention. But then you have longer lasting, conflicts, whether it was the war in Iraq, which, by year 4 was not good for ratings, or you have what was happening, in Syria, which by year 2 was becoming more and more difficult to get on air. And that's where, yes, you had myself and a handful of other colleagues at CNN, and then that's when it flips, right? You don't wait for the network to deploy you, you start pushing for deployments. And this actually takes us back to the conversation of local journalists, because I would need to constantly talk to them, talk to all of my contacts on the ground, whether they were journalists or just people who I had met, or people working in the medical space and what have you, to say, I need to pitch a story to CNN to get Syria back on the air. I need your help, like just hit me with everything that you've got and we'll pull together something, because I know, and this goes back to maybe a conversation about where collaboration can also happen, because local journalists know what they're seeing and living. We know how to sell it to our networks, and thereby that's actually the chain of what ends up, getting something on air. And sometimes it does take a struggle. You do need to say, like, hey, listen, like, I know people are really tired of hearing about Syria, and yes, it does seem like it's, the same thing day in and day out, but this is how I'm going to go in and do the story a bit differently this time, or this is why it is, what's happening in Syria right now at this specific junction in time is geopolitically significant, and try to frame it in that way. Because much in the same way that, us foreign correspondents, I mean, yeah, we do parachute into a lot of these areas that we work in. And we do need to be bombarded with information that we can absorb before we can even begin to do a semi-decent job of reporting it. Our editors also are constantly across all of these different stories all over the world. So we need to be able to take what a local journalist is saying, or what people on the ground are saying, living, feeling, translate that into something that can go to the editors in a way that is going to be very straightforward and very palatable for them, in terms of making the case as to why this story needs to stay on air and needs to still be a part of a broader conversation.
Thank you, Aurora. And Celine, you were also mentioning that you did try to warn the network like months in advance about what was going to happen, and you want to share the experience with us?
Yes, of course, because I think it's very linked to what Arwa said. Like, for months and months, I was sending emails without even pitching a story or whatever, but just explaining, I'm aware that news agencies are not very covering the region. So here I give you some context and some elements of what's actually happening here. And knowing their logics, I was always trying to show what were the link with bigger headlines for them, with like war in Ukraine, Iran, Turkey, Israel, etc. And I say this for France 24, but it's not only the case. Like other French medias, like it's all main international medias basically, not only did not like rejected my propositions or my stories, but it just ignored me, like I was facing void. And it is our responsibility to push for our stories, that's for sure. But at some point, it needs some reciprocity. We might be willing to fight for our topics, but if we are not being heard on the other side, how can we get anything published and then prevent on anything? And I think this is more generally, of course, always linked to the structure of 24 hours medias that just go too fast on their topics and just like try to cover the whole world all at once, and like therefore just don't pay attention to yeah, it's like our regions and the information that we get that are very interconnected to the whole rest is actually being drowned in an ocean of news. And this is a bit discouraging sometimes, but of course we need to keep pushing and insisting.
Indeed. And Carlos, you were also mentioning that sometimes you had to twist the news, like to give it another angle so that it would interest the publication.
Yeah, the problem with countries like Armenia, regions like the Caucasus, is that you have all these networks of media covering either the MENA region or the Middle East or Asia Pacific or Europe. So when you come up with a story from Armenia, then there's a technical discussion here. So where do we place Armenia on the map? It's not the Middle East, it's not Asia Pacific, obviously. So you need to hook it somehow. As Stalin said before, the war in Ukraine or something going on in Iran. I'm always telling my trainees, if you want to sell stories from Armenia, give me an Iranian angle, because Iran, as we all know, is a black spot. Unfortunately, there's no proper reporting from the ground. Or I remember during the war in Karabakh, it was very difficult to sell these stories, because if you remember, we had these elections in the US, and we had these vote recounting for a whole week, which happened during the last week of the war. So there was no budget, and my only chance was to find, in this case, a Middle East angle. So there were these Israeli drones hitting badly Stepanakert and the whole area. So I tell my trainees, look for angles, like in this case, trying to get a Palestinian angle to put Armenia on the map. Unfortunately, that's the way we often have to do it. Armenia by itself, or the Caucasus by itself, unless you're talking about very regional media outlets such as, I don't know, OC Media or EurasiaNet, it is tricky. It's really tricky to sell. And when it gets easy, then it's too late. You know, then there's this horrible war going on unfolding in the region, or this brutal blockade. And that's the thing I mentioned before when it comes to the blockade. Even if you want to go there as a foreigner, you can't. There's no access. There's no other way than relying on local journalists. So yeah, this is very much a challenge.
Yes, thank you for that. And I just want to go back also to the blockade and to go that we actually saw it when there was also some internet communication blackouts in Gaza recently. Literally, we had no news for sometimes. Like we had no images where we were inundated with images. We had nothing. And then the first images that came after the blackout was lifted were from local journalists, clearly. But it was so hard to see what happened. It was like when you have no access to information, I feel that's when it's the most terrifying, because you literally don't know what happened. And then after that, when you see the images, you're like, oh my God. So, yeah. Have you ever experienced actually and would you want to share that, like, moments where you couldn't, either you had to self-censor, either you couldn't go and document, either you had to change the way you reported, and you want to share it with the audience so that they have an idea of how you get the news out?
So for me, actually, at CNN, and most people for some reason don't believe me when I say this, I've actually never once been asked to change what I'm reporting, modify how I'm reporting it, or that sort of a thing, which then lends itself to like a completely different topic of information, topic of conversation, because there is a certain level of kind of self-censorship that happens. And, maybe I had an advantage because, frankly, I'm probably one of the few people who I was going to tell it as I saw it, and the network never really pushed back on me on that. But, that being said, it does also sometimes become a bit harder, and you do encounter certain layers of verification when you touch certain topics. So, for example, early on in the war in Iraq, there were a number of instances where there would be civilian casualties that would happen after a US bombardment. And I'm talking like, 2004, 2005. Sort of scenario when America was still trying to sell the whole narrative of, hey, the war is going great, look at how happy Iraqis are, kind of thing. And we knew as CNN, as a network, that we had to be ironclad in our reporting, sourcing, and proof of what was coming to us, because the US military and the US administration were going to try to discredit our reporting. So there have been a number of instances, of that, and there does end up being, depending on, look, sourcing is always very important. Information always needs to be double and triple checked, but there are certain topics when you touch them, especially when it comes to, human rights abuses, when it comes to innocent people being killed, where you need these extra layers of verification, of proof, and of evidence, going all the way to, geolocating places to actually be able to say this is true when it comes to certain countries and the implications of what it is that you are reporting. Look, we're seeing this right now, right, with, Israel and Gaza. Like for a lot of the foreign networks that are reporting on that, they do, and they historically have always required extra levels of verification and evidence from the Palestinian side than from the Israeli side, and this goes across the board. And when trying to report on something that Israel has done, you do need to make sure that your proof is ironclad, which again goes back to the whole argument of, yes, local journalists are imperative. They're central to everything, but that's also why you do need foreign networks to a certain degree to have their own foreign correspondents on the ground. Because when we witness something, because we've already established that level of trust with our organization and to a certain degree with the audiences, it does, and I'm not saying that this is right, this is just the way that it is, it does carry extra weight with it.
Well, I would. Right.
No, go ahead. I was actually going to ask you if you wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, I think I would draw a line here between TV reporting and print reporting.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with TV reporting, never did. But when it comes to print reporting, I don't think it matters that much to have this guy or that guy. As long as the story works and that's it, and it's well built. And back to your question, in my case, the biggest censorship is the editor who won't answer to your emails, to your pitches. So I never had to twist any story. I never had to sort of manipulate or change the way I worded my pieces. It's just that you keep knocking on doors, and you know that with certain people, some stories won't work. So you simply don't pitch those. You know that with some media outlets, stories about Kurds in Turkey won't work at all, for example. Comes to mind the ethnic cleansing, because it was a completely underreported ethnic cleansing of the Kurds in the northeast of Syria. It was happening even when the war started in Gaza. So while Israel was shelling Gaza, Erdogan was also shelling these northern parts of Syria, and nobody was talking about that for some reason. So So yeah, it's not about twisting your stories. It's simply about not getting them published. I mean, not even getting an answer, not even getting a no from an editor. Yes, that's our case as freelance reporters.
Alina, I saw you agreeing. Do you want to add anything?
Well, I don't know about the. It's more a fact of sometimes being silenced because there is not the proper organization to allow us to go to some places, and therefore we can't cover things, and then it's not censored, but it's silenced because well, the communication, there's no communication structure in the Armenian government that allows us to do our job properly when things are very tense and critical. The first time I could experience it was when Azerbaijan attacked not Nagorno-Karabakh but Armenia proper in September 2022, and it went deep in the Armenian territory, places that we usually go on holidays and stuff like that, and we were impeached to go to those places because the military did not have the proper organization to allow journalists to go here and there, and military were just extremely tensed. And of course, Armenia is a small country that is its lands are quite recognizable, so this is something that they could have anticipated for a long time ago. And I saw that when I covered sometimes the war in Ukraine, where the structure was allowing journalists to work independently outside of group press, because the only ways we could access some points were through well, minivans filled with journalists who will be told, okay, you can go there, and then we come back home with having everybody has the same footage, and it's like it is problematic for us to document in an efficient way. And of course the fact that the impossibility to go to Nagorno-Karabakh for all since the end of the 2020 war, but during the blockade, and then during the starting of the forcibly displacement of population at the end of last September, it was very hard because we were on the other side of the border and we were hearing all those stories, all those atrocious rumors of people saying, yeah, I was in this village, here's what we saw, and people were describing terrifying war crimes, but what can we do with rumors? Nothing. And starting from there, it was very frustrating because we will never have a final answer to what actually happened, because the only way journalists were allowed to go there was maybe a week after the enclave was emptied of its inhabitants through very organized, strict press groups. People could started to document a bit, but we will never know what happened because everything could have been planned, or it was on the moment that we needed to be there, and it was impossible, and we will never know if all the testimonies that we gathered could have had some weight or not. So this is really a failure, I think, on a political one.
Yeah, I mean, just on, the topic of access and sometimes like what we need to do to be able to get access. I mean, if anything, any sort of censorship or blockage does tend to happen from a government or a military, oftentimes under the guise of security and the concerns for our personal security, and we can't guarantee your security. And then you get into the whole argument of, but I'm not asking you to guarantee my security. I'm a journalist. I'm going in. I'll sign whatever papers you want. Just let me go in and do my job. And it ends up being very, very tricky to try to move around in a lot of these areas when we are trying to go in at times when things are happening that other people who have a lot more power don't want to have uncovered.
It is really the dilemma. Like as an editor, I see it with the journalists that were sent to the south of Lebanon these days. Like we have measures in place for security, etc. And every time we send someone, let me be very clear. Like we're tracking them every minute, because it is a responsibility also to send someone in a zone that can be dangerous, where they can get killed. And it's we're literally on our phone making sure they're safe every time. So yeah.
No, Yeah, no, I actually, so totally random side story, but I ended up sitting in for the Baghdad bureau chief for like a week at one point in time. And I was like the correspondent that screamed my lungs off every single day to be allowed out the front door. When I had that responsibility, nobody left the house. But I mean more like, you know, when we're trying to access, say, you know, battle zone X and it's with any military, pick a military, any military, and they're like, no, we can't take you to that point because of whatever, it's not safe, or you're embedded you know, with the military and you want to go see something, and they're like, no, we can't. So I did a lot of embeds with the US military, which during the war in Iraq, which actually worked out quite well for me because we couldn't access all these parts of the country because it was so dangerous. But because I was an Arabic speaker, I could go, and even if it was a basic, you know, patrol through the market, I could still go and speak to Iraqis and, you know, get something out of it, or go on these, you know, more serious operations and speak to families as their homes were being searched and kind of work through it that way. But there's also a bunch of times when, you know, you can't even get through a checkpoint because you're trying to reach something that, you know, the government or whatever it is, you know, doesn't want you to see.
Well, yeah, I mean, embedding is something we've all done, you know, but there's no other way to get to places. But as long, for example, it comes to mind this coverage, so to say, of the conflict in Karabakh from the Azerbaijani side. I have these colleagues who simply jumped on a bus on this war tour organized by Baku, by Azerbaijan. I would, of course, jump on one of those tours, but I would always explain the reader the conditions in which I'm working. You know, you have to explain the readership that you're traveling with someone who's taking you here and there. He's never letting you speak into anyone by yourself. And basically you have to say that this is completely organized. Once you've said that, I mean, everything is fine. Or I would say that every time I embedded with the American troops in Afghanistan, there was no censorship of any kind. I mean, I could take pictures, I could report, and I could take footage, and there was no red line in that case. But unfortunately, yeah, back to Karabakh, we've seen these coverage from the Azerbaijani side, which was kind of, yeah, not too ethical.
I wanted to just go back a bit with to pitching stories to editors and to also news corporation, and I was wondering whether you did feel the difference between pitching a story to a news, like 24-hour news broadcast, or if it was easier to pitch some stories to long-form magazines or to a documentary, or like if you felt the difference, and if you feel that the 24 hours news cycle really affect the way that you work and you can document history of what's happening.
So I was 24-hour news. I mean, I was CNN for 17 years. And I think, you know, you get to a certain point where you have to recognize that is the framework, that is the reality of 24-hour news. It's 1 hour, you know, chunks. And within that 1 hour, there's a finite amount of time. And that is basically what you have to work with. But then separately, you have all these other platforms, right? Like CNN.com, you can have your shorter news piece and as part of the newscast, a longer version of it on the website. You can write your text on the website, that sort of a thing. For the last year and a half, I've been working on a documentary, and I've been, you know, kind of independent and writing. And I have to say, like, just for me, it's been an interesting sort of new space to try to explore, because I feel as I don't have enough experience as sort of an independent / freelancer to be able to speak to this with much authority. But I have felt in my brief experience that it is probably easier to get something into print than it is into TV. I mean, the bar for television, and I know this because freelancers used to pitch us and me all the time, the bar is really high to get something onto television, simply because of the finite amount of time that the network is working with per hour of each of its newscasts.
And you always have to. This one thing is news. For me as a freelancer, I cannot give news. You know, you have the CNN, you have Reuters, you have the BBC. Yeah, I mean the big channels and the agencies. So my market is features. So like stories, human stories. I cannot produce news as a freelancer. Nobody's going to get news from me. And then I lack that infrastructure to be able to cover news.
One thing that's for sure is for television, they just want very striking footage more and more. So they will, like what I was telling you about the lack of interest for 5 months is because I had nothing shocking, I guess, to show them. But once we had all those caravans of people who had their whole life in plastic bags, that was, in terms of image, that was finally interesting to them. And there it's very easy to pitch whatever you want, which I understand because it's through an emotional start that you can touch people and the audience. But yeah, you need to go like in documentaries and feature stories to be able to go in something slower that goes in more depth in all those complicated topics.
And speaking of sort of documenting and showing the world what happened, do you have like one story in mind that you wrote about, that you read also, that you pitched, where you felt that, hey, I documented something and it did create some change somewhere, even if it's just one person knowing about it? Do you have one of these stories that you're really like, that kind of keep you going these days?
No, I'm not laughing because it doesn't exist. I mean, no, it does, right? You know, it's for me at least, it's been kind of that one story where a kid's life changes because they're able to get medical assistance afterwards, or it's been that one story where a person finally feels heard to a certain degree, because especially when you're going back to these conflicts that have sort of either faded from the spotlight or never been in it at all, there's almost a thirst on the part of the people who have been suffering for so much to just have someone listen. And it's an entirely disproportionate sort of level of gratitude and comfort to a certain degree. And so, I mean, yeah, on some stories, it reached a point of, you know what, I'm going to go do this because people want someone to sit there and listen to them who's actually going to sit there and listen to them. And then, you know, there's the random person who you come across here and there who's like, oh, I watched your report and that's why I decided to go volunteer with refugees arriving in Greece. And then it's that little bit of a, okay, so, you know, maybe this is why I do what I do. But it, for me at least, it really goes back to the fact that, you know, no matter how hard it is, no matter how depressing it is, no matter how demoralizing it is, we just need to stop for a second and listen to think about what the world would look like if we didn't have journalism. And that is way scarier than anything the world looks like right now. So.
Well, I think about the blockade. It was going underreported for months. It started in December. Nobody was talking about that. I was knocking on every door. I was trying to help my trainees on the ground to get the stories out. No way. I think it wasn't until we had this comment by Luis Moreno Ocampo about possible genocide, potentially genocide happening in Karabakh, and that there was this trainer. We had AP reporter, the chief editor, Abby Sewell. So she was there in Goris. She was on the ground, and she had this Armenian byline from Kornitzer, from the very border. She wrote a short story about, well, basically just paraphrasing the comment by Luis Moreno Ocampo. And then this really simply skyrocketed. It was all over. It was the Wall Street Journal. It was the New York Times. It was all over. And I would say that was when the world started watching. I was thinking to myself, if this had happened before, if we had put the focus a few months back, maybe Azerbaijan would have refrained from doing what they did. You will never know. It was already too late. That was the point. So when it comes to stories that could change something, that's the one that comes. So a failed story, too late, I think. If this had happened in January, February, with all the world watching, would Azerbaijan have attacked Artsakh in September? We will never know.
But indeed, some of your trainees were in Stepanakert, and I think that makes an echo to what we were saying at the beginning. Like, if they don't know where to start with to get the attention of editors in chief. So if those voices that are not famous and that are discreet on their side and there are beginners could be heard, then massively heard, then maybe we could hope for an awareness that brings change, I guess.
We have 10 minutes to wrap up. I'm gonna check if there are any questions and open up for questions. For the audience, if you want to ask any questions, it's in the Q&A. I think that was for before. There was one question about the 24-hour news cycle, how it has affected the ability to responsibly report. I think we've answered that, except if anybody wants to add anything on that.
I don't think so.
I'm gonna, if I need to summarize or wrap up a bit, what was said is that there is a real need to document what happened more than necessarily create change straight away, but with the hope of creating change at one point. The fact also that very often when you document things, it's kind of the only moment when people feel heard, when people who have been victim of ethnic cleansing or genocide or war atrocities, this is kind of the only moment where they feel heard and they get some semblance of justice, which is really important. And we as journalists, I think, are just like one part of the big chain of people who can try to create change. So there is us, and there is the editor, then there is the social society, like the civic society, social society, the lawyers, international crime, the international court, like the UN, etc., etc. So I think this is kind of a wrap up. I have one question that just came up, which is, what should journalists do to push back against large news corporations? Are freelance unions a real possibility? Anybody wants to answer that one?
I mean, push back how? Like, to get their stories on there, I guess, would be what I would want.
Check if they answered. I don't know.
I mean, look, there's a certain reality to the whole, business news cycle. And, I think what's been quite interesting right now is watching how all these other alternative ways that people are getting their news is kind of building into a person's awareness of what's happening internationally. And we're especially really seeing it right now with Gaza and Israel. I mean, people are no longer reliant on the mainstream media as being the only prism that exists through which to view a conflict or a crisis. And that is kind of, changing the dynamic and to a certain degree, the media is also having to look at itself. I think right now it's quite an interesting time to be a part of, but also to see how moving forward the whole social media dimension is going to work towards how news ends up being news.
Yeah, and if there's a union maybe to create, it could be something like more of a link that needs to be more protected and more worked on between the storytellers that we are and the audience itself, because what journalism can bring is evidences and proofs, and thanks to investigation and all of that, international, of course, maybe can do something about it, but that are very long and slow process. So in the meantime, how do we make something emerge from the population, some sort of duty that comes from the population? How does the civil society respond to what they see from our side? And I think this is where indeed the social media that you're talking about are very important, because, and we see it in Gaza right now. I don't know if we've ever seen so many TikTok videos and Instagram videos being, so people are actually reporting, like the common people is actually showing proofs of what's happening thanks to those mediums. So how do we collaborate with this new way of telling the stories? And yeah, maybe it's also a sense of if the 24 hours news outlets format is too fast, it makes us question ourselves, like, is it possible to get to the heart of people, of the audience, with those short formats? Because this is what happens if an audience is being touched deeply, maybe then it can take the tools to responsibilize itself, and then try to tend to some sort of struggle. And maybe one of the poison to all this process too is a myth of objectivity that doesn't allow our contents to be more engaged and involved in some direction. Maybe it's a question of dialogue that we didn't know how to put in place with the audience, but now I think technology brings us the right tools for that. So like maybe it's a new work in progress that should be thought about.
You know, it's interesting there, because you talk about, you know, the news being too short or too fast or too quick, except, I mean, we're talking also about a TikTok generation that watches like 15-second video clips, right? So like, who knows how all these different pieces are going to end up kind of fitting together. And then, you know, and again, it's going to be quite interesting to see the role that news networks end up playing, because a lot of, you know, the videos that you see coming out, I mean, yes, 100%, the vast majority of it is happening in real time, and it's completely and totally sort of undeniable, right? Like, you're never going to deny a video that shows a child being pulled out from under a rubble. That child is being pulled out from under the rubble. But then you end up with other videos that are being put out there from all sides, all across, you know, the spectrum. And disinformation and deliberate misinformation ends up, you know, playing all of these games in all of this space. And then that's when, who do you turn to try to understand if what you're seeing is actually real or not? And then do you turn to the news networks, or have news networks begun to lose credibility because of a perceived and or existing bias? It's really messy.
Someone said that you answered the question, use more TikTok's videos as part of your reporting to keep the conversation going. Yeah, I know a lot of news, I mean, everyone is on TikTok today, including all the news corporations. So
well, for sure, like in a zone where there's no journalist that can access, I guess any kind of source should exist, and then big medias have the right tools and the right experts in fact checking to then check what has been taken, where it is more and more common in big news outlets. So let them record, let them share, and then maybe in medias there should be more space for more bigger teams for those fact-checking videos, and then that would be a collaboration that I think is interesting.
And they've been, you know, they've been growing a lot. There's like whole, you know, departments at the major news agencies right now, and literally all these people do is comb through social media for videos and then try to get in touch with the original source who posted it, get all information that they actually can from the person who actually posted it, and then cross-reference that with all sorts of different markers that they have, and try to, you know, geotag, geolocate, and verify in multi-layered different kinds of ways, the authenticity of that actual video.
And on that note, I think social media, I'm gonna wrap up and pass the floor to Roy Nock. Wanted to thank you very much for the panel. It was an honor, and hope to see you again soon. And Roy, the floor is yours.
Yeah, Marie, thank you very much. Before we end the seminar or the webinar, on behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank all moderators, speakers, and participants for their contributions and insights. Today, our overall topic was addressing genocide and ending human rights violations in the MENA region and finding pathways to a hopefully lasting justice. Allow me a short concluding remark. As we heard from different perspectives, the MENA region is currently home to many of the world's horrendous conflicts, many unsolved sectarian and ethnic tensions, as well as meddling of global and regional powers. As a result of the so-called Arab Spring, fragmentation and instability have grown in many countries of the region. The wars and belligerency in the Ukraine and Palestine and the South Caucasus put further spheres of conflicts on the table. Generally speaking, a sustainable development and stable democratic institutions in the MENA region can only be achieved when all the lethal and non-lethal conflicts in the region are solved politically, when the root causes of conflicts are addressed, and when all conflicting parties and affected civil society are included in this progress. The absent inclusion of civil society and mostly independent media within the debate of peace and security in the region seems to be one of the biggest obstacles to lasting solutions. As was discussed in the first panel, on the different cases studies on Artsakh Armenians, the Yazidis, and the people in Palestine, Armenia has just ratified the Rome Statute of the ICC and is also a member state along with Jordan, Tunisia, and Afghanistan. These few states' commitment is the one main problem of the legal prosecution of genocide and human rights violations in the MENA region. This is a very difficult task, of course, for an already ponderous international legal system. So possibly enhancing the discourse about peace and security in the region, shifting the focus from hard security topics to softer and more inclusive aspects like participation in general and the role of minorities and to secure their rights is key as well. Another important point mentioned in the panel discussion is the overall shift in the international system from creating peace through legal obligations and contracts to pacify conflicts through violence. This echoes this year's 100 years of the Treaty of Lausanne. This treaty from July 1923 had a global impact on the handling of ethnic religious conflicts. The population exchange stipulated there served as a worldwide example of conflict resolution through the forced segregation or expulsion of peoples. These strategies, to speak with Hannah Arendt, seem to linger in the subterranean stream of history and have finally come to the surface and usurped the dignity of human condition again and again. Due to the limited time, let me just add a personal comment connecting with panel 2, which broached the issue of media and public opinion, its role in preventing and ending all forms of human rights violations and crimes against humanity. I am ashamed and furious how uninformed the media in Europe reported on the forced and violent expulsion of Artsakh Armenians. Especially in Germany, where the history of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the first weeks of the expulsion took place on an amateurish level, mostly uninformed and repeating perpetrator propaganda as well, even though there have been enough civil society actors and freelancers who have been informing the media landscape constantly. Even Armenian German journalists were asked by their editorial offices whether they were not biased in their reporting, as if all those suffering Ukrainians in the German media had been accused of something similar. I don't think so. All the aspects and possibilities of preventing genocide and enhancing human rights in the MENA region discussed today are not so easy to realize, of course. And especially in a poly-crisis world, it sometimes feels hopeless between what is humanly necessary and what can be realized socially and politically. But I hope we keep it with Martin Luther King, who once said, "We must accept final disappointment, but never lose infinite hope." Thank you very much, and be safe wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, the audience. And I think, Yara, we can end the webinar now.